Welcome, everybody, to the American Space Museum. I'm Mark Marquette, and we're so glad you're with us today to stay curious. Today, we're going to honor these three astronauts of the Apollo 1 who lost their lives, of course, in the Apollo 1 fire on January 27th, 1967. Wow, that's 56 years ago. And I know Marty, my co-producer, who worked on the Grumman lunar module, you remember that date very well. I remember as a teenager very well, Marty.
Yeah, I definitely do remember it. Yeah.
But we're going to honor the astronauts. We're not going to talk too much about the tragedy. And there's so much that's been written over the past half a decade, half a century, I mean, about these wonderful astronauts. But here they are honored in a wonderful pencil drawing by Doug Forrest. Doug Forrest, a good friend of our museum, Doug Forrester. And Doug Forrester is in Los Angeles watching today, no doubt. Several of you said that you were anxious to watch today's program, like John Darling, Einar Skeen, John Cusack said he'd be watching. Beverly Rother, good to see your name pop up there, young lady. She's
Doug
moved
is
from the
watching.
Space Coast. Pardon me?
Doug is watching.
Good. Hi, Doug. Pam Shivik, Christopher Mick, Mike Madrano, and Carl Gunther said they'd be watching Stay Curious on our tees on Facebook. So we want to always honor our fallen heroes in NASA's darkest week, and we have a celebration of their lives that's going to happen this Sunday at Sandpoint Park. Marty Winkle and I will be bringing that to you on our YouTube channel, also on Facebook Live. 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Tune in. Fingers crossed, everything will work good, and you'll hear some dignitaries. The Israeli consulate's going to be there with a dignitary talking about Ilan Raman, the Israeli astronaut who lost his life on Columbia. And astronaut Nicole Stott is going to do the featured presentation and talking about the sacrifices made as she went to space twice. So good friend of our museum too. So this is at Sandpoint Park. That's at the foot of the big bridge in downtown Titusville. Let me have a little rocket fuel there to get me going here. And so we hope that you can watch it. If you're in the area, please attend it. It's very patriotic, very reverent. 21 gun salute at the end, and there will be some A-listers of the Kennedy Space Center and Cape Canaveral Space Force there to honor our 17 fallen astronauts and a few more. What we're going to do today is talk about the Apollo astronauts in a way that that I've heard them be talked about among the space workers, like Marty, and some of the wonderful stories I've heard told about them. But it all starts with their logo. And Marty, I'm not getting my pictures up there. The picture file. All right. Nope. There's that one. And then go forward. We're missing the we're missing the patch, and there might be a reason that the patch isn't there, Marty, because I didn't reload it maybe. Once I changed the size of it.
Yeah, but I checked the size, and the size was good.
All right.
But apparently
All right. Well, we'll see the patch here in a few minutes. It's I wanted to talk a little about the patch, and we'll talk about the patch later. Here's a color photograph of the three astronauts situated as they would have been that tragic night. Gus Grissom is above my head, and the center is Ed White, and rookie Roger Chaffee over there on the left. Of course, Gus Grissom, Mercury 7 astronaut, suborbital flight in his Liberty Bell that sunk in the ocean, no fault of his. And he was commander of the maiden flight of the Gemini 2 spacecraft with John Young. And then the next flight, Ed White did a spacewalk with Jim McDivitt. And yeah, there they are inside in a black and white photograph to show you kind of how cramped it is in there. They got their helmets on in this picture. And we're going to talk about the fire in general terms here. What I've found is when Well, I've talked to several people who had headsets on and heard the communication, and you look in some of these Apollo workers' eyes that were pad 34 working there that day, or weren't working there because their shift wasn't on there. You see it in their eyes, the hurt, the still 50 years later. It's amazing how this has touched so many lives and never leaves them. The tragedy on the pad, which of course the new Apollo Command Module was undergoing an important test on Cape Canaveral Launch Complex 34 just 10 days before its February launch in the maiden voyage of the Apollo Command Module. Gone just like that were veteran astronauts and American heroes Gus Grissom and Ed White, and talented rookie Roger Chaffee. Their deaths may have saved others, as the electrical short circuit that started the fire resulted in thousands of changes and modifications to the Apollo spacecraft. Their sacrifice created a safe and wonderful spaceship on its 9 voyages to the moon and 6 other Earth orbiting missions during Apollo Skylab and the Apollo Soyuz missions. Let's first look at this photograph here, where this is during the high altitude test. The Apollo 1 astronauts getting in a different, this is in the ONC, Marty. The flight training was in the operations and checkout. There's no um, escape tower on this. But as you can see, the crampedness there, several people had offices outside this area on pad 34. This is not pad 34, but this is the air atmospheric test chamber where they simulate a space craft being to the extreme temperatures and gauge how the electronics and everything's working on it. So, but it gives you an idea of how the stage would have been set. A lot of things came into play that didn't happen, like that escape tower was armed with solid rocket, and if that had gotten hot enough to launch, more lives would have been lost, and more things would have happened. Of course, Apollo 7 in October 1968 flew from this very pad. The it was about, it was 6 or so in the evening. I don't 6:30. I'm not exactly the time was 6:31 when they heard a fire in the cockpit. They called this a plugs out countdown demonstration, as if the spacecraft was on its internal sources. And I'm going to talk during Gus Grissom about some of the stories of what probably happened to create that spark. Interestingly enough, the astronauts, Grissom and Chaffee, were, of course, from Purdue University, and they attended the Rose Bowl game January 2nd with other Purdue nauts, Gene Cernan and Neil Armstrong, in 1967. So that was one of the bigger football games of any time, would be the Rose Bowl, Marty, where the Big Ten champion meets the Pacific Pac-10 champion. Hope it was Ohio State and USC, but I didn't look that up there. It could have been Michigan and UCLA for all I know. But so Chaffee already getting the rewards of being an astronaut, having not yet flown. Let's look at the life of Roger Chaffee, as I want to try to stick to a script and make this an enjoyable celebration of these gentlemen's lives. Born in Grand Rapids, Michigan, Roger attended college on a Navy ROTC scholarship at the Illinois Institute of Technology, and then transferred to Purdue University and graduated there like Gus Grissom, his commander. Chaffee became a seasoned Navy lieutenant commander. He became one of the youngest pilots to fly top secret photo reconnaissance planes during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He did not, in fact, fly I'm looking there. Did not fly a U-2 as some of them reported. The U-2 was an Air Force spy plane, and Roger was in the Navy. All right. But he was involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis, flew 82 missions over Cuba. All right. And although a rookie in space, he was chosen in 1963 of one of the third group of astronauts. And I see that, Marty. Thank you. Although a rookie in space, he spent years supporting the Gemini program, most publicly as Capcom on Gemini 4 and Ed White's spacewalk. So he knew Ed very well. Marty said somebody's told us that Rose Bowl of 1967 was Indiana and USC,
And Indiana won.
and Indiana won. All right, who's telling us that?
Me.
Oh, you. Okay, thanks for looking that up. Well, no wonder they were there. Purdue, is a Big Ten team, but Indiana also is. So, um, smart, teachable, and very likable, Roger was on a fast track for a future fame as a moonwalker. This is how we've honored our astronauts at Spaceview Park, those that died before the year 2000 when they started harvesting the handprints for the bronze placards there. Uh, Sandy Storm did a beautiful likeness of them that's embossed there. And recognize any space workers there, Marty? No, I don't recognize anybody up there that I've met. So,
Ted Augustine, if you know him.
Roger Chaffee was 31 when he died, and his resting place is in Arlington National Cemetery beside his Apollo 1 commander, Gus Grissom. And a couple things to pull up here on Roger that I wanted to mention was in Grand Rapids, which is also the hometown of Jack Lausema, and my father was born in Grand Rapids, Michigan. They honored him with a beautiful life-size statue, okay, and he would have been on Wally Schirra's crew, but Don Isley was on Apollo 1, all right? And many people don't know this, but Don Isley he had to require surgery when he dislocated his shoulder in a weightless training aircraft, the KC-135, the Vomit Comet. He got his shoulder injured, had to have surgery. He would have been on Apollo 1, Don Isley. And so Chaffee replaced him, and he was reassigned to Wally Schirra's crew, the second Apollo crew there. Little trivia there. There's an excellent PBS or documentary that I saw on one of the PBS channels a while back with Cheryl Chaffee talking about her father. I've met Cheryl Chaffee. She's on the astronaut scholarship, and she's on the Memorial Foundation that's responsible for the mirror out there. And it was a very interesting documentary about this sculpture. You see this being made before your eyes. But she also talked about the hardship that she and her brother had after her dad's death, and that her mother, this is all out there to see. She aired a little bit of dirty laundry that they were never really visited by NASA officials after the funeral. Her Stephen is her brother. Cheryl Lynn was born in 1958, and her brother was born in 1961. So, and I got to meet her at a function and said I thought she was very brave, saying that, kind of calling out NASA, that they really, there was life insurance and that sort of stuff exchanged, but to find out the mental state and so forth of she and her brother, she says they suffered because of the lack of proper mental health, which thank God today everybody knows these traumatic things. Astronauts are assigned another astronaut that helps with the family on these emergencies and so forth. So kind of a sad story, though, she was telling there, Cheryl Chaffee, about her dad's death and how they never really heard from NASA much afterwards. So that is out there for your viewing pleasure, too, to hear about that. There's the beautiful statue of him. I would have loved to seen him mature as an astronaut, Marty. He would have been the top guys, I think, probably young enough to segue into the shuttle era. May have been a pilot, we wouldn't have had Edgar Mitchell or Jim Irwin or maybe Charlie Duke as moonwalkers. We would have had Roger Chaffee. So and that's his life. Though he had not been to space, talking to Ed White on the live during his spacewalk and so forth, Roger Chaffee said, "The world itself looks cleaner and so much more beautiful. Maybe we can make it that way, the way God intended it being, by giving everyone eventually the new perspective from out in space." Now think of that. Roger Chaffee in 1967 is saying he wanted to give everyone a new perspective from out in space. And look at what the private company of Blue Origin's doing with 20 or so people that have experienced that dream of Roger Chaffee's on a suborbital flight. All right, Marty, next, did we have anything else to share there? We're going to next talk about Ed White there in his Gemini suit. Air Force Colonel Ed White was the first American to make a spacewalk on Gemini 4 in 1965. Look at his steely gaze there as the Apollo 1 astronauts were introduced. Serious stuff, and there's Gus Grissom on the far right, whose flat top is only rivaled by Walt Cunningham's. Marty, you got a question?
Yeah, Neil 1030 wants to know, do we know if Martha Chaffee is still with us?
I believe she's not. I'm pretty sure that she's passed away, Ed's Roger's wife. Marty's going to effort that for us there and look that up for us. Colonel Ed White, and I love this spacewalk shot of him by Jim McDivitt, who we lost a couple months ago. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Ed White was the first American to make a spacewalk on Gemini 4 in 1965. The images of him soaring in space for 23 minutes are still frequently seen today. It is considered one of the most historic, memorable spacewalks. America had a new word, extravehicular activity, or EVA. And when the EVA was over, Ed White said to the world, "I'm coming back in, and it's the saddest moment of my life." White was born in San Antonio, Texas, and excelled in all sports. Here is that EVA from the perspective of Chris Calley. Beautiful piece of artwork from our friend and renowned world artist Chris Calley. At West Point, Ed White was an All-American track athlete who just missed qualifying for the Olympics by a fraction of a second in the 400-meter hurdle. At University of Michigan, White earned a degree in aeronautical engineering and then was selected to attend the U.S. Air Force Test Pilot School at Edwards Air Force Base in California. White was one of 9 men chosen as part of the second group of astronauts in 1962 within an already elite group, and shown here with McDivitt over there at the left for the launch there. White was one of 9 chosen in the second group. There he is, like I said, with McDivitt for the Gemini 4 mission. He was considered by management to be one of the most highly skilled astronauts, just like his best friend in the 16-member astronaut corps, Neil Armstrong. Ed White was age 36 when he died. He's buried at West Point Cemetery in New York. Marty, you had someone you looked up there about Martha Chaffee.
Yeah, she passed away on June 20th, 2017 at the age of 77.
Okay. 2000, not 17. Oh, yeah, 2017. Okay, age 77. Thank you, Marty.
2015.
Thank you for looking that up. Yeah, Ed White, definitely one of my heroes growing up. I, as a kid, I've said this before, I have a little brother, Craig, and there's the bust of Ed White out at Spaceview Park, just a few blocks from where I'm sitting. Yeah, I'd have my little brother on the top bunk so I could be on the bottom bunk, and those springs and everything, I could pretend were the dials and toggle switches on a Gemini spacecraft as I was pretending to be John Glenn or Ed White doing a space walk out there. So really, again, this was a stellar crew. This was a crew that was going to fly in space multiple times. on a maiden, and you have to know your stuff to be on a maiden space voyage of any spacecraft. Well, Marty, I think this is the only kind of classic photo that I'm sharing today for our Stay Curious audience, taken outside the gantry at Pad 34. Um, we famously have in our Mercury and Gemini gallery, we talk about a man named Sam Bedingfield, who was a founder of our museum and has been gone about 12 years. Sam Bedingfield started working at the Space Center because of Gus Grissom. They went to Purdue together, and when Sam Bedingfield graduated, he went to work on a tobacco farm of his family in North Carolina. Well, one day, this is a true story, Gus Grissom called up Sam and said, "Sam, I'm here at Cape Kennedy. I'm an astronaut, or Cape Canaveral it was, of course. I'm an astronaut, and we're going to build rockets and go to the moon. Why don't you come down here and help me?" And Sam Bedingfield said to Gus Grissom, "I know nothing about rockets." And Gus said, "Don't worry, nobody does." And a very famous story and a true story. Nobody knew what was involved in going to the moon at the time. It was all learning while you're on the fly, sort of thing. So I wanted to share that story with you all, and also share the fact that the astronauts did have some trepidations about this spacecraft. Okay, you could enlarge that, Marty. They all astronauts, even in the Gemini times, had a gag photo that they would take, and they would don goofy hats, looking like hillbillies here, for example. Or on one famous photograph, the astronauts are actually praying over the command module. Now, Gus Grissom, who was known definitely as the architect of the Gemini 2 spacecraft, it was called the Gusmobile. And because he decided where the instrumentation was going to be. Being a test pilot and already been to space, suborbital, and having some idea from his Mercury guys what was going on, he did all this. But can you believe that this photograph is, of course, hard to find on NASA paper anymore? But yes, Marty, you have a comment or question.
Yeah, Robert Lloyd's asking, is it true that had he lived, Ed White would have been first on the moon?
True that probably it would not have been Ed White, it would have been Gus Grissom. But yes, there is a lot of. Deke Slayton in his book said that he tapped Gus Grissom to go be the first man on the moon. And I'll share that with you right now as we're looking at Gus and his flight suit there. He was a diminutive man, about 5'6". That was to his advantage. He was very high strung, very demanding. He was very focused. He did want to be the first man on the moon. He was as driven as Buzz Aldrin to be the first man on the moon in many ways. Gus was one of the original Mercury astronauts flying the second suborbital mission in 1962. He then commanded the maiden flight of the two-man Gemini with the late John Young in March 1965. Gus was the shortest of the Mercury 7 and a fierce competitor. He was born in the small town of Mitchell, Indiana, and joined the U.S. Army Air Forces in World War II. He earned a Bachelor of Science degree from Purdue University, one of now Purdue Knott's, I think, number 26. He went on to the Air Force in the Korean War, flying an F-86 Sabre jet, just like John Glenn. Captain Grissom was a test pilot when he was one of 508 applicants for the new NASA space pilots. They called them space pilots at the time. In April '59, he and 6 other alpha males were announced to the world as America's Mercury 7 astronauts. I love this picture of Gus right here. Well, to know Gus was the competition among the Mercury astronauts to one be the first suborbital and then be the first orbit definitely was coming down to Gus, John Young in the middle, and Alan Shepard on the right, and definitely the shortest of the astronauts. Okay, but he did one suborbital mission and then segued into the Gemini flight. I was privileged to attend several years ago the Apollo 1 private memorial service at the abandoned Launch Complex 34 on Cape Canaveral, and I enjoyed talking to Gus's 70-year-old son, Scott Grissom. The full moon was rising over the hallowed ground, and we'll see a picture of that here in a minute as we look at one of my favorite pictures of Gus. He's got a flashlight in his hand there, looking and checking out some of the instrumentation. I walked off this wonderful and honored to be there celebration on a January 27th, by the way. And the full moon was rising over the hollow ground. Scott Grissom looked up at me and looked at the moon. He remarked, Deke Slayton wrote about my dad being the first choice to land there. Deke told me many times my dad was the first choice. Dad was going to choose his own crew. And you could see it in Scott Grissom's eyes looking up at that moon that evening, that the dream seemed to still be alive in his eyes. Gus Grissom was 40 years old when he died, and he rests at Arlington National Cemetery. And the stories of Gus are boundless about his ingenuity, his tenacity, and he was just so involved with the development of the spacecraft. Let's check out this picture of Gus there. Of course, the hair has to be shaved off the chest for all these sensors to be put on there, and that thermometer was always stuck somewhere. And you can see how thrilled he is at it there. This is actually at Hangar S, all right, where the chimpanzees were kept. And the astronauts didn't like that smell or those chimpanzees carrying on, and they quickly bought a Holiday Inn for themselves, and which is still on the strip at A1A. It's now a Comfort Inn. And the Siam Orchids right beside it, a good place to eat there. So a couple of items I wanted to talk about was about the tragedy. As you see another spoof shot here. Not sure what was involved here, Marty. There is Wally Schirra, and of course MA4 was a suborbital flight. And why is he strapped in like that with his legs like that? I don't know if they were a spoof or he fell asleep, and but no one's laughing. Somebody one day will tell me the story behind this photo. But I'll bet you didn't know that President Johnson, I've been to the LBJ Ranch outside of Austin, Texas. It was a very small ranch. It was a very famous in the news of the day, where they'd have all of the leaders in our cabinet would be out there talking about the Vietnam War. And Gus Grissom had what he called freedom stones, where you came, visit him. You didn't sign a big book, of guest book. You signed a piece of concrete that was laid out when you got off the little plane there at his little runway. And this was July 21st, 1961. All right, after his flight. And there's Gus Grissom's autograph. A good G. He always made the proper G that our cursive class always taught us to do. Very clear there. And that's my hands on Gus Grissom's signature at the Freedom Stones. Beside him, I think, is also signing them was Al Shepard and John Glenn. They all went out there to visit the ranch one time. And of course, talking about Gus there in an unusual shot with John Young, rookie. There's the seasoned veteran and his rookie, and saying, "Hey, you do good by me, boy, and maybe I'll tap you to be my pilot on the moon flight there." Who knows what would have happened, and who he would have chosen to go with him to the moon. And just to show you how cramped, this is a simulator, and they put some strobes on their laps basically to give you kind of a spooky looking shot there, dramatic light effect there, but an unusual shot of the commander's on the left hand seat there, and then the pilot's on the right. And you shut those gull wings down, your head was just inches above there. Very claustrophobic. Most of us have seen a Gemini spacecraft in captivity at a museum near you. So what actually happened? All right, what happened is that um, I've heard many space workers talk in front of me about this tragedy and how it hurts, and how one day a couple of guys were in the conference room saying they were just being interviewed for Apollo 50th anniversary, and these two gentlemen, one said to the other, "Well, when are they going to do the real documentary on what happened with Apollo 1 and the fire?" And my ears perked up. I'm going, "What are they talking about here, Marty?" And I won't reveal their names, but very reliable sources. They were there. One of them had the headphones in his hands, and so what they were talking about was when Gus Grissom said famously, "How can we talk between two build? How can we talk from the Earth to the Moon when we can't talk between two buildings?" Well, then the conversation got interesting, because the conversation went like, well, Gus went off mic and said, "I have to pee." He had to go to the bathroom. And so when you're looking at this picture, Marty, and you see yourself laying in the laying reposed down, most men know that's a very awkward position to empty your bladder. And you'd rather be vertical, standing up doing it, okay? Here we're looking at the Spaceview Park again, the Gemini imprint there, the two for the, and to look out there at that's that moonrise I was talking about in 2021 when we were out there for that. So you go, what? I have to go to the bathroom, is what he said offline. Gus is over there, so he probably moved to his right. And if you can imagine moving over to his right there and swinging his leg over so he could kind of stand up a little bit. Behind the astronauts is a deeper area that they would take these chairs that they're sitting in down, basically lawn chairs, and stow them, and then they would have a bigger area. Well, the big area, the lower bay, is right there behind them. So he may have moved over and hung his leg out there so he could get a more comfortable position to relieve his bladder. When his foot touched the bottom there, it rubbed some wires that were not properly covered. A spark happened. Bingo. That is what I've heard from two space workers who were there listening on the headset. One was listening on the headset and one was part of the review board. And I've heard this from two other astronauts think that that's what actually happened is that Gus did move his foot down back in there to rub these wires, and the fire started underneath Ed White there. And you can do all of the reading you want, and documentaries about the hatch was too heavy and cumbersome to get open quickly, and the new hatch was designed. And but these gentlemen are honored forever out there at Pad 34. Like I said, what an honor to go out there myself. And there's a couple plaques out there, and this one plaque says, of course, that's the one I want, at the dismantled Launch Pad 34 in Cape Canaveral, where these astronauts died. This memorial plaque says they gave their lives in service to their country in the ongoing exploration of humankind's final frontier. Remember them not for how they died, but for those ideals for which they lived. And that's how we're going to end our program at Spaceview Park on Sunday with this. A couple other stories to tell you. One, this is Gus Grissom's brother, Lowell, who's in his late 80s, standing beside his brother's flight suit that he wore after the Gemini 3 mission. There he is in a picture there on the wall wearing that. And he's got a sweatshirt on that says Gusmobile. Usually Lowell comes and enjoys the festivities and is honored to be out there at the service that they have at Pad 34, as well as the Mirror at the Kennedy Space Center. I emailed him, and he's not going to be around this year. He lives in St. Louis. Actually, he was a space worker himself. And Marty, what an honor it was to interview Lowell a couple times. We did it the old school way. But what do you have to say about this great man? He really carries his brother's name honorably, doesn't he?
Yeah, he sure does. And he just looks like Gus. They're just the way you envision Gus looking when he was.
Oh
Oh
my
my
gosh,
gosh,
they're
they're
just
just
dead ringers for each other. They had a lot of fun playing together as boys. And as you'll see here, he really embraces his. In fact, this is his business card. Okay, remember Gus, Ed, and Roger. That is the beautiful Lowell Grissom in the background. There's card that he's handed out to me and many other people. Just a beautiful man, and we're missing you on the Space Coast, Lowell. Continued good health to you. Uh, as we look at Scott uh, Grissom there, and he's got his head down there in the orange shirt. Gold shirt, walking away from that ceremony with the moon rising above the pad. I'll relate the story that 100-year-old, we lost Doris Ripley this year. I think she was 101 years old. We talked to her on one of my first interviews I did with anybody dealing with the Apollo era. Doris was a secretary in the secretary pool at Cape Canaveral. Her husband worked in the Apollo program. And she remembers the Friday night everyone went to dinner for a nice steak dinner out at the Mousetrap on A1A. And the Mousetrap is where the Marty there is kind of behind Ron John's, but it's where there's a Florida seafood or something's there, they call it.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's there now, but it's north of Ron John.
Yeah, north of Ron John, exactly. She's listening to a band with her husband, and I'm thinking this isn't a rock and roll band. No, it's like a Tommy Dorsey, Glenn Miller band in 1967 with and some nice soft music being played. And she said that the owner of the Mousetrap got up to the microphone, tapped his glass, got everyone's attention, and said, "We've had a problem out at the pad. 3 of our astronauts have died out there." And she said the place went dead silence. This beautiful lady, Doris Ripley, said that she'd never heard a man cry before, sobbing. Men were sobbing. The saxophone player played, or trumpet player, one of them played "Fly Me to the Moon" very softly, as the owner said, drinks are on the house, and people picked up their tab and left. Very sad. And then Doris Ripley said she looked at her husband and they didn't know if they had a job Monday. All right. Here was the good times about the first Apollo launch in February, everybody working for that goal, and then the tragedy struck. And she said when they went back to work Monday, she remembers, in hearing all around men sobbing. I just distinctly remember Doris Ripley saying she never heard men cry before like that. And just it gets me to think about it, talking to people like Ernie Rios, who passed away. Ernie's office was right outside there. He worked the night shift like you did, Marty. And when he got the phone call, he was buying a boat, he said, that Friday evening and getting ready to go into his shift at 11 o'clock, buying a family boat. And they said, "No, don't come now, come in later and do your job. Everything's just put on hold here. It'll be here when you get in." So just a very, very emotional, sad time for a lot of people that even 56 years later, it's very fresh on their mind. And Marty, you've seen it. It's just the vacancy in people's minds who have been there, just taking them back to that horrible night and what they had to do for their job there. So we don't ever want to forget. And thank you for letting us share this about these wonderful astronauts of Apollo 1. There is the memorial to them at our nation's cemetery, Arlington. Doug Forrest, thank you for letting us use your beautiful artwork behind us here. Doug specializes in Apollo program art. I think his website's called Apollo in Space or Apollo Art. Carlton Bailey's watching. I owe you a phone call, sir. Cynthia Rossi, Robert Law, Dave Stange, Mark and Tom Usiak are watching. Ophelia is watching in Normandy, France. Steve Hammer, Chris Callie, thank you for letting us share your artwork, Chris. Tom Celentano, Bill Whiting, Neil 1030, and Mike Bostick are all enjoying Stay Curious today. Tomorrow we're going to go down and talk about the Challenger astronauts and give you a quick thumbnail bio of each of them. And then Friday we're going to end our show, our Stay Curious week, with the Columbia astronauts. I want you to know a little bit about where they grew up, a little about their lives, and sort of more importantly, where their honored remains are these days. So, Marty, what'd you hold up there, my friend? Mike Madrano. Madrano. Okay. Thank you all for watching our Stay Curious. Hope that you watch our memorial presentation 1 o'clock Sunday. They're going to have a Thursday memorial at the Space Mirror, I believe is when that's taken place. I was been honored to be out there before. This was 1990. This is 2018, I believe, and there's Buzz Aldrin putting flowers out there, and Buzz walked away at this moment and then did a salute there to his fallen comrades. So we hope that you can watch us on Sandpoint Park, or come to it, or be on us virtually on YouTube at 1 o'clock. All right, so. Marty, thank you for a good Streamlabs program there. Thank you all for being with us today. And join me tomorrow, Mark Marquette, as we bridge the space between us with the Challenger 7 astronauts as we honor their lives, just as we did the Apollo 1 heroes today. So hope to see you tomorrow, and thank you for watching.